History is written by the victors, and sometimes it is rewritten by those who fear the truth. Few mysteries capture this idea as chillingly as the fate of Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, better known to the world as the Princes in the Tower. In 1483, these two boys aged just 12 and 9 were taken into the Tower of London, supposedly for their protection. Within months, their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, crowned himself Richard III, claiming their father's throne. The boys were never seen again. Their disappearance, whispered as murder, became one of the darkest and most debated crimes in English history. But what really happened to the princes? Were they murdered at the hands of their ambitious uncle? Were they eliminated by rivals later on? Or did they somehow survive, only for impostors and pretenders to rise in their name years later? This is not only a story of two missing children, it is a story of a dynasty dripping in blood, of civil war, political ambition, propaganda, and one of the longest-standing unsolved mysteries in royal history. To understand the tragedy of the princes, we must first understand the world they were born into, the Wars of the Roses. For 3 decades in the 15th century, England was torn apart by a dynastic conflict between the House of Lancaster, symbolized by the Red Rose, and the House of York, symbolized by the White Rose. It was not a war in the modern sense. There were no standing armies, no nationwide campaigns. Instead, it was a series of brutal civil wars, rebellions, betrayals, and shifting loyalties among the nobility. The crown was never secure. Kings were overthrown, reinstated, and murdered. Families rose and fell in bloody cycles. And at the center of this chaos was the Yorkist King Edward IV, the father of the two princes. Edward IV was a tall, charismatic warrior king. He claimed the throne by defeating the Lancastrians in battle, but his reign was riddled with enemies, both Lancastrians, who longed to restore their house, and ambitious nobles within his own Yorkist ranks who were angered by his decisions. One of Edward IV's most controversial choices was his marriage. Instead of strengthening his rule with a foreign princess, he married Elizabeth Woodville, a widow from a relatively modest family. This marriage brought Elizabeth's relatives into power, enraging the old nobility, especially Richard Neville, the powerful Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker. This decision set into motion a ripple effect of jealousy, resentment, and betrayal tensions that would later play a role in the downfall of Edward's sons. The two boys at the heart of this mystery were born into extraordinary privilege, but also extraordinary danger. Edward V, born in 1470, was heir to the English throne. From childhood, he was groomed to rule, described as intelligent, serious, and well-educated. Edward was just 12 years old when his father died. His younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, was born in 1473. At only 9 years old, he was still very much a child when history consumed him. He was said to be more playful, bright-eyed, and spirited than his older brother. Together, they were symbols of Yorkist legitimacy. But to those who wished to claim the throne, they were obstacles, small, vulnerable obstacles that stood in the way of great ambition. In April 1483, King Edward IV died suddenly at the age of just 40. His death was a shock, and it left his son, Prince Edward, as King Edward VIII. But Edward was only a boy. He would need a protector, a regent, to rule until he came of age. Edward IV's will reportedly appointed his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as protector of the realm. Richard had been loyal to Edward throughout his reign, serving him faithfully in war and politics. By reputation, Richard was serious, pious, and militarily skilled. Many trusted him, but power, as history shows us, can corrupt even the most loyal of men. When Edward IV died, the Woodvilles, the Queen's family, moved quickly to secure control over the young king. They arranged to escort Edward V to London with a large armed retinue. This alarmed Richard of Gloucester, who saw it as a threat to his role as protector. In a bold move, Richard intercepted the party, arrested several of the boy king's supporters, and took custody of Edward himself. The young prince was escorted to London, under Richard's control, and lodged in the Tower of London, a royal residence but also a state prison. It was the beginning of the end. At first, it seemed that Richard was merely protecting his nephew's crown, but step by step, Richard moved closer to seizing it for himself. First, he began accusing the Woodvilles of treason, executing some of them. Then, he questioned the legitimacy of Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, claiming it had been invalid because Edward was supposedly PI contracted to another woman. If the marriage was invalid, then Edward's children, including Edward V and his brother Richard, were illegitimate and could not inherit the throne. This was a radical move, but it gave Richard the legal excuse to claim the crown. and in June 1483, he did just that. Richard of Gloucester was crowned Richard III. What then of the two princes? They were quietly moved deeper into the Tower. Witnesses saw them playing in the gardens in early summer, but by the end of 1483, they were gone forever. So, what happened to the princes in the Tower? Here, history descends into shadows and theories. 1. Murdered by Richard III. The most popular theory immortalized by Shakespeare. Richard III is that Richard ordered their deaths to secure his throne. Two small boys, locked in the Tower, would always be a threat as long as they lived. Rumors swirled almost immediately after their disappearance, and Richard's enemies used it as propaganda against him. 2. Killed by the Duke of Buckingham. Another suspect is Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. Once Richard's ally, but later his enemy, Buckingham may have had his own ambitions for the throne, and could have acted without Richard's knowledge. 3. Eliminated by Henry Tudor's allies. Another theory points to Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII, who defeated Richard at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. Perhaps Henry or his supporters killed the princes to clear the path for his own claim. After all, if the princes lived, Henry's legitimacy would always be challenged. 4. Survival and pretenders. A tantalizing theory suggests that at least one prince escaped. This may explain the appearance of pretenders like Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, years later. While most historians dismiss Warbeck as a fraud, his existence kept the mystery alive. In 1674, during renovations at the Tower of London, workers discovered a wooden box buried beneath a staircase. Inside were two small skeletons. Many believed they were the remains of the princes. King Charles II ordered the bones placed in Westminster Abbey, where they still rest today. Modern science, however, has never confirmed the identity of these bones. The Church of England has resisted calls for DNA testing. Without such evidence, the fate of the princes remains unsolved. The story of the princes in the Tower has haunted England for centuries. They became symbols of innocence destroyed by ambition. Shakespeare painted Richard III as a hunchbacked villain, forever cementing him in public imagination as the murderer of his nephews. But was Richard guilty? Or was he a victim of propaganda spread by the Tudors, who had every reason to blacken his name after seizing the throne? The mystery endures because the truth was buried with the boys, or whoever lies in that casket at Westminster Abbey. 500 years later, the fate of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, still grips us. Two young boys, heirs to a kingdom, vanished into the shadows of the Tower. Their story is a reminder that behind every throne lies betrayal, ambition, and blood. Were they murdered in cold blood? Were they victims of political necessity? Or do their bones still lie hidden, waiting to tell us their story? Until we know for certain, the princes in the Tower will remain one of the darkest and most enduring mysteries in the history of crime. And now, over to you. Do you believe Richard III murdered his nephews to secure the crown? Or were they victims of another hand in this brutal power struggle? Drop your thoughts in the comments, I'll be reading them all. And if you love exploring the world's darkest crimes and mysteries, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. We'll see you in the next episode. Until then, stay curious, stay safe,